Hello. Welcome to the first episode of Happy Nightmares. We present to you a story of unfortunate circumstance, mysterious intrusion, and unstoppable evil. We hope you enjoy. Watch the child.
Part 1. Mark. At 5:05 a.m., Mark McAfee sat straight up in his bed and screamed like a 5-year-old girl whose ponytail had just been sucked up into a vacuum cleaner. When he was done screaming, he took a moment to figure out what was going on. He could not remember his nightmare, or what about it had been frightening enough to make him involuntarily react the way that he had. He was confused, but he was also angry because Mark McAfee doesn't scream. Mark McAfee drinks protein shakes, does 100 push-ups every morning, closes sales, regularly takes home multiple women, and occasionally refers to himself in the third person. But Mark McAfee does not scream. Mark grabbed his cell phone from the nightstand and pressed a button to illuminate the screen's digital clock. Only 10 minutes until his alarm would be buzzing frantically. Instead of laying back down for 10 minutes, Mark threw back his comforter, swung his legs over the side of the bed, stretched his arms up high, and then disabled the pending alarm. He stood up, cracked his neck, and then dropped to the ground and knocked out 100 push-ups as easily as one might bench press a napkin. When that was done, he went into the bathroom to take care of nature's business. As he stood in front of the toilet, he realized that something just didn't feel right. Waking up like that, it was so out of character for Mark, and it was not sitting well with him. Not just the screaming, although that was ridiculous, but the fact that he had no idea what he had been dreaming about.
Perhaps it had not been a dream that had caused him to wake.
Mark finished his necessary task and then went to the sink where he washed his hands vigorously. He splashed some water on his face, stood up straight, and regarded himself in the mirror. He thought to himself, "Mark, you are a good-looking man." Then he tossed his reflection a wink. He smiled, and then headed to the kitchen where he scrambled 4 eggs in a glass bowl and poured them into a skillet next to 3 strips of bacon. He placed the skillet on the stove, and then started brewing a pot of dark roast with the help of Mr. Coffee. While his breakfast cooked, Mark grabbed a remote control from the counter and powered on his kitchen television. The sounds of early morning news filled the room. Mark was feeling better, ready to conquer another day in the riveting world of corporate phone system sales, when he heard a loud thud. He grabbed his remote and muted the TV. Even though the sound had been brief, Mark could tell that it had come from his bedroom. He set down his spatula and walked cautiously down the hall. Mark may have been arrogant, but he wasn't stupid, and he knew better than to go charging into a room if there might be someone in there with a weapon of some kind. Part of him hoped that there was someone breaking into his house. He would love the opportunity to take them down and then hold them captive while they waited for the police. The door to Mark's bedroom was open a crack, and all of the lights were off. It was early enough that the sun had not yet breached the horizon, leaving the room in complete darkness. "Hello?" Mark said loudly through the nearly closed door. There was no response. Slowly, Mark pushed open the door with his left hand. With his right hand, he reached for the light switch just within the shadows. Then, he heard something move behind him. Part 2. Kris. Kris Falk stood in front of his bathroom mirror, attempting his necktie for the 4th time, a skill he had never fully developed. He could hear his 3 children running wild downstairs and laugh to himself. Although his job at the firm was stressful, he did not envy his wife, who was a stay-at-home mother. He loved his children very much and wanted nothing more than to spend more time with them. But all day, every day, would be a tiresome task. No, he did not envy her, but he did admire her. He met Karen in his second year of law school at the University of Chicago. She had broken the ice in a coffee shop one day by introducing herself and asking him if he had ever climbed Mount Everest. Kris remembered not being able to tell if she was actually asking him or if this was the first part of a strange pickup line. He also remembered not caring because she was absolutely gorgeous. So he answered as any college boy would have. He said, "Yes, twice." Then they both laughed and had lunch together. Karen had graduated near the top of her class, Kris only slightly behind her, and he proposed to her the day after graduation. Karen didn't go looking for a job right away, as she was planning the wedding. They were married that fall, and the day they got home from their honeymoon, they found out they were pregnant. She went from college student to bride-to-be to wife to expecting mother in less than a year, and she couldn't stop smiling about any of it. As soon as she saw that positive readout, she knew that her parents would not be happy to find out that they had spent a lot of money for a PhD in staying at home with the kids. They weren't thrilled, but they reacted as any new grandparents would have, with excitement and hugs and unsolicited advice. Time flowed and life moved on. In the kitchen, Karen Falk finished pouring her husband a fresh mug of black coffee as he entered the room. "Your tie's a little short," she said. Kris lowered his head and closed his eyes, letting out a long sigh of surrender. Karen laughed and walked over to him. "Don't worry," she said. "Ties just aren't your thing." She loosened his tie a little, made some adjustments, and tightened it back up. It was the perfect length. She kissed him briefly but sweetly on the lips, and walked back to the stove where she was finishing breakfast. Kris watched after her and then looked over at his kids playing in the living room. "We have a great life," he said to his wife, pausing after to have a sip of hot coffee. "You noticed?" she said jokingly. They both laughed, and Kris sat down at the kitchen table to read the morning newspaper. Part 3. Mark. The first thing that registered in Mark's confused mind was that his head did not hurt. If someone had hit him, his head would be throbbing. He had no recollection of finding the light switch, but as he slowly opened his eyes, he saw that the room was bright. Before moving, he tried to take stock of how he was feeling. The room wasn't spinning. He was able to wiggle all of his fingers and toes, and his jaw seemed fine. He wasn't seeing double, but his vision was slightly blurred. That could be explained by adjusting to the light, same as waking up first thing in the morning. Deciding that his body was in pretty good shape, he moved to his hands and knees, paying close attention to the world around him. If it started to turn gray or white, or if it started swirling or spinning, he would get back to the ground immediately. Mark tried to replay the morning's events and figure out how they could have led to his loss of consciousness. As his eyes adjusted, he discerned that the light had not been turned on, but rather the sun had risen. His bedroom window faced west, so the light was pale, and this meant that Mark had been lying on the ground, half in his bedroom, half in the hallway, for at least a couple of hours. The room was steady, and Mark's eyesight was back to normal. He got to his feet, still maintaining some level of caution, and took slow steps around the corner to his dresser, flipping the light switch on his way. Atop his black dresser was a large mirror, and it was Mark's intention to use this mirror to examine his face for any signs that might clue him into what had happened. Two things prevented him from doing this. As he turned, he noticed a slight breeze whispering through his open bedroom window, a window that had been closed when he first woke earlier that morning. Even more curious, the window was only open about 2 inches, not enough for a person to squeeze through, and it was a crank-out, so the opening and closing had to be done from the inside. There were no signs of the window being forced either open or closed. Mark was bewildered as his brain tried to put together what seemed to be pieces from very different puzzles. He gave up on the window when his nose finally registered the smell of burnt eggs and bacon from his kitchen. He turned, meaning to leave the room and turn off the stove he had left on, but that was when he noticed a small, torn piece of paper twitching in the breeze from the open window. The paper was taped to his mirror, one more thing that Mark didn't remember doing. He walked over to the mirror and took the paper fragment in his fingers. The tape stayed on the mirror. The paper looked old and yellowed. It was thick and rough. The writing was cursive and barely legible on the crude stationery. Mark read, "In light of morning, cool, sweet breeze, the sunlight warms and sets the day on fire." Mark looked over at the window and the sunlight shining through it. He felt the breeze. Then he turned back to the paper, and as Mark continued to read, a strange thing happened. Children's voices filled the air, reading along with him. They were almost singing softly in his mind, urging him to continue the poem. "True love, it seems, waits slowly by, and sweet songs in small voices fill the air. Take heed and follow, watch the child, she walks toward beauty." The voices swirled through Mark's head. Mark began to feel disoriented, and his eyelids grew heavy. The children laughed and sang. Mark was lulled into a trance and became enthralled by the poem echoing through his head as through a deep cavern. His eyes moved lazily from the page to the doorway, where a small girl now stood in a purple sundress with full white daisies on it. She was wavering in and out of focus, and Mark had to squint his eyes a bit to get a good look at her. She was smiling, she looked eager, and she was waiting for him. Without Mark's approval, his feet began to move, step after step, as the girl led him out of his bedroom, down the hall, and toward the front door. As Mark read the mysterious words a second time, still dressed only in his boxer shorts and a white undershirt, he walked out the front door and into the day. Part 4. Suzan. Suzan Martise stood at her kitchen sink washing breakfast dishes and listening to the songbirds currently twittering in the lilac bushes just outside her kitchen window. As a breeze crept through the open window, Suzan closed her eyes and took the morning deep into her lungs. She smiled. At the age of 53, Suzan had been a cigarette widow for about 7 years now. At this stage of Suzan's life, her slim figure was a thing of the past. She had to watch how much salt she put on her food, and she had gotten over the worst of her grief over losing her soulmate, but in the morning, she still found it painful to sit at the kitchen table alone, which is why she typically ate her breakfast standing at the window. Plunging her sponge into the warm, soapy water, she began to think back on her late husband, of his wonderful Sunday morning breakfasts and their weekend trips to Lake Francis. Sadness filled her, but she did not cry. She had cried many tears for her husband in the first 3 years after his death and found then that she had none left, but the pain in her heart stung strong as ever. The singing birds calmed her, and she closed her eyes once again to listen. That was when she heard her neighbor's screen door bang closed, startling her. She opened her eyes quickly and watched with confusion as her neighbor, dressed in nothing but his boxer shorts and an undershirt, began walking down his driveway. At first she laughed, wondering if maybe the man didn't realize that he had not yet dressed. He was holding something in front of his face with his right hand, and seemed to be studying that object rather than watching where he was going. Suzan wondered if maybe he was going to the mailbox, but when he reached the bottom of the driveway and turned left instead of right to head down the sidewalk, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. As she watched this spectacle, she struggled to remember the man's name. He had only lived there for a couple of months, and she mostly kept to herself these days, but Lucille across the street had told her once. Finally it came to her. "Mr. McAfee!" she yelled out the open window, more than loud enough for him to hear, but he did not respond. He didn't turn. He didn't even flinch at the sound of his name. Something was definitely wrong. In a moment of bravery, all the while questioning why she was so certain the man needed assistance, Suzan put down her dishes, slipped on her shoes, and headed out the door in her robe after her neighbor. Part 5. Kris. Kris stood at the kitchen sink helping his wife clean up the dishes before heading off to work. The kitchen window was open, and they could hear the birds singing outside. When the dishes were finished, Kris picked up his briefcase and headed to the front door, where his wife met him with the kids. She gave him a big kiss, and then he kissed each one of his children before heading out the door to his car. The day was cool, with a strong breeze in the air, but the sun was bright. Despite the brisk wind, Kris immediately rolled down the windows of his new Toyota and slipped on his sunglasses. He turned on the radio and scanned to the local classic rock station, pulled out of the driveway, and waved to his family as he drove off. With his windows down and his music blasting, Kris Falk flew down the road, headed for his office downtown. The song on the radio ended, and the peppy radio personality gave a traffic update. Kris was amazed at the number of wrecks that had been taking place over the past hour. Huge pileups caused apparently by some guy walking around in his boxer shorts? No, he must have misheard. That was ludicrous. Still, a few of the big wrecks were right on his way to work. Throwing a frustrated fist against the steering wheel, Kris came to a stop at the intersection of Fairway and Hillshire. The intersection was packed with crunched cars. This wreck had apparently not been reported yet because it had not been mentioned in the traffic report. Kris dug his cell phone out of his pocket and called the office to let them know that he would be late. Then he sat back, turned up the music, and waited for the cleanup crew. From the sirens in the distance, he figured they weren't too far off. Part 6. Mark. Mark walked down the driveway and took a left at the sidewalk. The little girl danced and skipped in front of him. Her legs moved quickly, but his long adult strides had no problem keeping up. He glanced drowsily at her every once in a while to make sure he was still following, but his main focus remained on the paper. He read the poem over and over again as the children's voices chanted along with him in his mind. They were loud and drowned out all other sounds of the day. A woman yelled in the distance, but Mark did not hear. Cars passed through his housing addition, drivers looking shocked at the man walking down the sidewalk in his undergarments, but Mark was oblivious. The poem and the little girl consumed him. Sweet songs in small voices fill the air. Take heed and follow. Watch the child. Mark reached the end of the housing addition and continued straight on into the thick rush of morning traffic. The child strode across 3 busy lanes without a care, and Mark followed. A pickup truck horn blared, and it swerved out of the way just in time, the driver yelling profanities out of the open window. Mark did not flinch. A gray sedan also swerved, but was not nearly as lucky as the truck. The car missed Mark, but collided with a telephone pole, nearly crushing an innocent woman on the corner. The driver slumped, unconscious. More cars swerved, more horns blared, but Mark kept walking. Take heed and follow. Watch the child. The poem was ingrained in his head now. He still held the piece of paper tightly between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, but no longer needed to look at it. His arms swung lazily at his sides as the traffic weaved and crashed around him. When he reached the grass median, now 3 lanes on either side of him, he turned left and began walking down the divider. A few angry drivers from less serious wrecks got out of their crumpled vehicles and were chasing after Mark. They walked behind him, yelling and taunting him. One woman even walked directly beside him, waving her arms and trying to get his attention, but he was not aware of any of them. In Mark's world, all that existed were the little girl and the words. The children's voices had grown louder and their laughter more menacing. Mark took another right turn as traffic sped through a busy intersection. There was now quite a mob of people following him. No one could understand why this man was not responding to them. The group muttered comments about Mark being drunk or on drugs, or maybe having suffered a mental break. Several more aggressive members of the mob had stepped forward and pushed him down, but each time this happened, the little girl in her pretty purple dress came and helped him back to his feet, and he continued to follow her. The woman that had been yelling beside him was no longer flailing her arms or trying to get his attention, but was doing her best to protect him. She stood in the way when someone rushed at him. She did her best to explain that something was wrong, that he didn't know what he was doing, but no one would listen. The angry mob wanted to pummel the man for causing so much destruction. Watch the child. She walks toward beauty. In the distance, beyond Mark's field of focus, was a large overpass. The little girl cut back across the road, once again directly into oncoming traffic, and Mark followed. "There he goes again!" someone from the mob yelled. Mark continued across the street and onto the shoulder, where he walked through the tall grass on the side of the road toward the overpass.
Mark, Susan, Kris. 3 people living 3 separate lives. Their paths entwined by a force that none of them understand. Stay tuned for part 2 of Watch the Child. Thank you so much for listening. Come back soon, and, as always, happy nightmares.